So looking at the snapshot of Myanmar economy in 2026, could you say that from your experience from the ground that Myanmar is a failed state?
I don't think you can say Myanmar is a failed state because the thing that would so surprised me, even landing on the ground, is the economy is working.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Asia Forward podcast, where we discuss forward-thinking ideas in Southeast Asia. My name is Ei Thant Sin, and I will be your host today. I am an independent journalist, and I've been following Myanmar issues for over a decade, and I was also born and raised in Myanmar. So how fitting it is that we are here for the Myanmar episode today. In this episode, we will explore whether the uncertainty in Myanmar means to investment outlooks in Southeast Asia. To dive deeper into this topic, I have invited Ambassador Susan Stevenson, who has just returned from Myanmar less than a month ago upon her retirement from over 26 years in the State Department. She served as Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy Yangon for almost 3 years. So thanks for joining us today, Ambassador.
It's my pleasure, E. I'm happy to be here.
We cannot ignore Myanmar's complex political history and the ongoing humanitarian crisis. But for the sake of this episode, we're going to explore whether it is even an option for new U.S. businesses to enter Myanmar or existing businesses to expand right at this moment. Our goal today is to take a step beyond politics and to have a conversation about the overall business climate and operational conditions. I am pleased to have Ambassador Susan Stevenson to help tackle our questions. So, Ambassador, you were just in Myanmar recently, and more recent than I have been. So I have to ask you, how are things in Myanmar, and what is the real situation on the ground from your vantage point?
First of all, I should emphasize that I'm speaking now in a personal capacity because, as you mentioned, I did retire from the State Department in January after 33 years total as a diplomat. So wow. I was with the U.S. Information Agency before joining the State Department. In Myanmar now, I think we have to take a step back and look at the overall business environment since the 2021 coup, because it has been pretty difficult for businesses. When the military took over the country, there was immediately a concern about the economy and a desire to conserve hard currency. So there were a number of factors that made things more difficult for businesses. Number one, rule of law concerns, because the State Administration Council, the SAC, did have rather capricious lawmaking, that they did not have a parliament, they didn't have an independent judiciary, and so all decisions were made by, in effect, this State Administration Council. And so at the last minute, businesses would have to navigate several different changes. Then, because of the desire to conserve hard currency, to allow the military to buy weapons and buy ammunition from overseas, there was this very complicated, which still exists, a series of exchange rate measures. And I think there was a misconception because of sanctions the U.S. government levied on the military, the leaders, some state-run enterprises, in 2023, 2 banks that were state-owned that the military relied on for their foreign currency. So there was a misconception that the United States did not want American companies to be doing business in Myanmar. Actually, that wasn't true, that we knew that U.S. businesses had high-quality employment and labor standards and would help lift up the economic environment and the employment for all people. But we did have a number of cautions, and we particularly cautioned people against doing business with military or state-run enterprises because that could run reputational risk, but more importantly, you could run afoul of sanctions because there are active sanctions on those entities. Anything to do with Russia, because there's separate sanctions because of the further invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, for new businesses, the State Department does have a consular warning saying Myanmar is travel level 4, do not travel. And the reason for that is the ongoing conflict with different armed groups really across the country. Since the 2021 coup, the outbreak of violence has just exploded. And so because of that, the State Department has maintained this travel level 4.
So the elections have concluded. With that, there are expectations that the political and security situations might get better, and some economic liberalization may be plausible. So are those expectations well-founded?
There was, over the past year since the election was announced, to my surprise, a lot of enthusiasm, or at least optimism, among the business community. And this, I would say, is both the Myanmar, the indigenous business community, and the expatriate American business community. At one point, I asked a Myanmar business person, like, why are you so optimistic? And he said, well, I have to be because I'm in business. But I think people recognized that after the 4.5 years of grinding conflict, when the military announced the elections at the end of July of 2025, this was an opportunity to change the status quo. There had been hopes that maybe there was a military solution, I think misplaced on both sides, both the military and then the opposition groups. And not to get too into the geopolitical, but there are lots of different opposition groups, so it's not a unified set. But once that was clear that it's pretty much a stalemate, if there's a military solution, it is a decade in the future. And so the idea of an election to change the status quo was welcomed. We were at the embassy a little skeptical. Of course, we're waiting to see once a parliament now is seated and is going to select the government. But there is a wide expectation that the commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing, will be the person named president. And so I personally am skeptical that he will change any of the policies. But I think there are a few things to look for. Number one, right now there's an embargo on ammunition and weapons to the opposition groups imposed by the United Wa State Army under duress by China. Will that hold? And if that holds, will that put the opposition groups at a disadvantage to make them more susceptible to ceasefires? And the reason this is important is the whole reason for all these exchange rate controls and import license controls to conserve hard currency is because the military needs to buy more weapons and ammunition. The second reason for optimism, and again, I personally am skeptical, but it could be that Min Aung Hlaing realizes that to get the support of the public, because he is very unpopular among the general population, he may want to liberalize the economy to placate the business sector and the people. Because Myanmar alone is the only country in ASEAN that have not recouped all the losses from the pandemic. And so I think there was modest growth expectations for 2026, but even 2025 with the devastating earthquake outside of Mandalay and Sagaing, the World Bank had to reassess and see the 2025 to 2026 economic outlook shrinking again by 2 to 2.5%. So because of all this, maybe Min Aung Hlaing or the resulting regime will feel like they need to do some economic liberalization.
So looking at the snapshot of Myanmar economy in 2026, could you say that from your experience from the ground that Myanmar is a failed state? And could you tell us why or why not?
I don't think you can say Myanmar is a failed state because
failed economy wise?
And it's the thing that what so surprised me, even landing on the ground, is the economy is working. You can't say it's a failed state because there is some control exercised out of Naypyidaw. There is some control on borders. The U.S. Embassy and other embassies have to go through Naypyidaw for visas, import of goods for embassies, diplomatic pouches, et cetera. So there is some control exercised by a de facto authority. So we can't say it's a failed state. And the economy, because of the extraordinary resilience of the Myanmar people, is still functioning. Now, unfortunately, that is driven a lot to the black market or the black economy or gray economy. And so I had talked to a Myanmar business person shortly after I arrived in 2023 and heard about these import license restrictions. And he told me he hadn't received an import license in 3 years. So I thought, my gosh, how are you doing your business?
Yeah.
And he sort of smiled because it was clear there were informal routes and land borders going across the border, particularly from Thailand. So people were coping. And immediately they were saying, okay, I can't get things the official way, so I'm going to go through some importer. I don't care how they do it, but they are going to get the goods in and then they will deliver it to me. Or suddenly people have to get things from the border. Instead of just paying one checkpoint, they're having to pay several checkpoints. So the cost of transportation has gone up exponentially as you have to pay off separate armed groups, then you have to pay off the military, and then you finally get to where you need to go, but it's still functioning. So the incredible resilience of people who have learned from decades how to work around misguided policies from the center means that Myanmar is still functioning quite surprisingly.
I want to talk about the shadow economy. It might just be even bigger than the actual economy. With the economic hardships in the country, with conscription law, people leaving the country, and the political instability as well. The environment has created a thriving environment for transnational crime, including scam centers and drug trade. So with the shadow economy outshining the actual economy, how can we get past that?
So there are lots of attempts to estimate what the shadow economy is worth. The most recent I had seen is the World Bank thought it was about 50% of the legitimate economy. I had heard wild estimates, as you had just alluded to,
Right.
that it was even bigger than the illicit economy. And I think it's just hard to pinpoint. And in fact, one of our enduring frustrations is not being able to estimate how much the scam centers were making or how much they were bilking Americans out of. The closest we got was the U.S. Institute of Peace estimated for 2024 that scam centers across Southeast Asia had cheated Americans out of about $10 billion. Now, obviously, $10 billion, and if you look on a map, even though Myanmar doesn't have the highest number of scam centers, it does have the biggest operations. From a satellite, it looks like a little city in some of these scam centers. So those are consequential operations. The other thing that I was never able to get an estimate about is what is the rate of return? So from forced labor versus volunteer labor. One of the things we know from non-governmental organizations that help rescue trafficked victims of forced labor and scam centers is they think that there is a shift now more to willing workers. And we did see this. You had mentioned conscription.
Right.
When the military regime announced in February 2024 that they were going to actually impose this law that had been passed in 2010 but never actually put into practice to forcibly conscript people in the population 18 to 35, including older people if they had special skills, you saw some panic. And what we do hear reports of is that able-bodied young men in particular, between this 18 and 35, they might see working in a scam center as like better than being in a bank because not only are they being paid pretty good wages because the average wage now, I think the daily, or at least the daily rate was like 7,000 kyat, which is still below what it was in real terms.
Like less than $2.
Right. Yeah. And so it's just nothing. But also, if you're working in a scam center, you're beyond the reach of the military for being conscripted. And people in non-regime areas, and there are big swaths of the country that the regime doesn't control, they're being conscripted by these ethnic armed organizations too. So suddenly working in a scam center, like maybe it's not a great job, but it looks pretty attractive compared to the alternatives.
Yeah, with a lot of Myanmar people, including especially the youth leaving the country, there's a large influx of refugee and migrant workers into the neighboring ASEAN countries. And how does this quote-unquote brain drain affects the economy in Myanmar?
I mean, obviously, it affects every facet of the economy. So I talked to rice farmers in the Irrawaddy Delta who suddenly didn't have the laborers to help them clear harvest the crops. So that's the big problem for farming, and that would translate to other different types of crops as well. And then in the manufacturing sector, that is just really hard to find laborers because so many people have traveled abroad, either to Thailand, they've gone on work permits to Korea, to Japan, they've tried to study overseas. So it really is affecting the labor market. It is pretty tight, particularly the unskilled labor. But even the skilled labor, because so many people after the coup walked out of universities, then they're trying to finish their studies abroad. So you are going to have lasting impact. When the military regime did the census in 2024, they estimated about 50 million people. And the last census, I think, was like 56 or even higher. So that's a lot of people missing.
Yeah. And I want to go back to the topic about sanctions. United States is one of the countries that impose sanctions on Myanmar, especially military entities. And do sanctions work? And what do they achieve? And if they have managed to do it? And I want to ask you, how are sanctions affecting the current economy in Myanmar?
Sanctions are a blunt instrument, so they do have an impact. But I think the United States imposing sanctions, the ultimate goal was to compel the military to step down, and that did not work. Did it make it more difficult for the military regime? Yes. Particularly these two sanctions on state-owned banks in 2023. I think it was in June in 2023, those were imposed. That did, some characterized it as a bullseye. I mean, that did have an impact for the military's ability to get hard currency, because those were the two banks that were the throughput for hard currency. But in the end, it was still pushed down on the populace. So I think our strategy of diplomatic and economic isolation, it can go only so far. So at the end of the day, it depends on what you're trying to do. The Lowy Institute had an excellent report, I think in early 2024, about the limitations of sanctions, and just detailed how the military regime in Naypyidaw kept pushing sanctions down on the people. So that's why the import license restrictions are so heavy. And even talking to people like the Livestock Federation or the Rice Federation, if they needed to import fertilizer or pesticide or animal feed, the quotas each year for import licenses kept decreasing because of this push to be self-sufficient. So you wouldn't need hard currency for that, and the military can use their hard currency for their own, materiel to wage the ongoing war. So I think sanctions, they're not without impact, but sanctions in and of themselves are not going to end the military regime, and they're not going to end the conflict.
One of the difficult things that United States businesses would have to deal with when thinking about entering or staying in Myanmar is the notion of sanctions and whether they might accidentally end up working with the sanctions entity, and also have to think about reputational risk as well. So how would they be perceived if this large company go into Myanmar and working there? With that, can you really avoid working with the military or sanctions entity for United States businesses to actually thrive working in Myanmar?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There is enough of a private sector that one does not have to work with the military regime. The U.S. Department of Treasury does have a list of sanctioned entities on its website that anyone could look up to make sure that the companies they're working with are not on that list. I mean, one of the difficulties is the companies that are sanctioned can change their name. So this happened with Ei Thant Sin, which was one of the sanctioned companies because of jet fuel, and then they changed their name to something else.
I guess they have their own workarounds.
Yes. But that's why we issued the supplemental business advisory in January of 2024, so that businesses had that extra guidance so that they would know that the United States doesn't actually want American companies to leave. We think they're doing an important service, as I said earlier, to the economy and to the workers. And we saw this when sanctions were imposed in the early 2000s. You had companies like Liz Claiborne pulling out. And at the end of the day, these weren't military enterprises. I talked to a garment factory owner who said she had 3 different companies and she lost 2 of them and had to fire like 1,000 workers because she lost all the orders from the United States. And at the end of the day, she wasn't helping the military. So who did that really hurt. It hurt the Myanmar people. And that's why we wanted to emphasize, even with Article 33 deliberations at the International Labour Organization, we wanted to make sure that, yes, Naypyidaw is held to account to allow freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom from forced labor, but that companies, particularly the garment sector that employs so many vulnerable women, that they weren't disproportionately impacted. So you have to kind of thread the needle to make sure that the private sector can continue. So I think if companies do their due diligence, they have to find local partners. They can find that. And companies that are already there and invested and have manufacturing, I mean, there is money to buy things, even like high-end automobiles or luxury goods. So if they can get enough import licenses to sustain manufacturing, they can make a profit. And so the United States, working through the American Chamber of Commerce with the U.S. Embassy, we did try to emphasize, if you're here, stay. You have to make your own calculus, but you are really helping the people, not the military regime. But as I said, don't work with state-owned enterprises. Don't work with military-adjacent enterprises. Make sure that you're looking at that sanction list. Be careful on these certain industries so that you don't run afoul.
The United States' newfound overall priority is in critical minerals. And do you see U.S. and private sector taking an interest in that direction?
Well, the United States government has certainly made its interest in critical minerals known. The president has talked about Greenland, and he has talked about other areas, Ukraine. There's an agreement signed with Thailand about critical minerals, even though I don't think that there are that many critical minerals in Thailand. Myanmar is unique in that Kachin State has heavy rare earths, which are in dysprosium and terbium that are needed for solar panels and batteries. And then there are other critical minerals that you need for weapons and other uses. The problem with commercial development of rare earths in Myanmar is that they are in areas that are just very hard to access. And as part of the offensive in 2024, late 2023 and 2024, the Karen Independence Organization took over the heavy rare earths mining sites that there are in Kachin State. And as I mentioned, that's a state that has pockets of regime control, but then pockets of opposition control or ethnic armed group control. So if you're going to develop those mines, first of all, I think there are Chinese companies that are already operating there. So even if you were able to get a concession from those areas, then you'd have to figure out what are you going to do with them? So you'd have to make a deal with a non-state actor. Then you'd have to somehow figure out transportation out, which would almost necessarily mean going through regime-hold or Naypyidaw-held territory. So you'd have to have some kind of agreement there too. So I think it's like we saw with gas and oil development, where the companies were driven to riskier and riskier areas. I think development of critical minerals in Myanmar might have to wait until there's a shortage elsewhere, because I think there are other areas that are much more accessible and easier to mine.
Yeah, in other words, it is harder to surpass working with the sanctioned entities, right, when trying to get critical minerals out of Myanmar.
Well, you wouldn't have to work, so we don't have sanctions currently on the Kachin Independence Organization, Kachin Independence Organization, but then it is a non-state actor who has control for now of these areas. So that is a political risk one has to take. And then to get through regime-held areas, you're not necessarily doing business with the military unless you had to enter an agreement with a transportation company that's aligned.
And another thing is, you mentioned China. And in Myanmar, there's already pre-existing China and other companies that are running businesses and running well, I suppose. And where do you see room for U.S. companies to compete or complement the existing players in Myanmar?
The United States does have, because of laws we've enacted in this country and because of the reputation that the companies want to maintain, a higher quality of employment, labor standards. We had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I mean, we just generally hold our our companies and firms to high standards. And so therefore, going into a country like Myanmar, that the United States companies are paying over what the minimum wage is, because we know that the consumers back in the United States would not like to hear about exploitative labor practices. And we've seen this time and again when there's press reports about sweatshop labor conditions, that American companies get shunned, and they really want to avoid that. And I've toured the Ford Motor Company, Coca-Cola bottling, Ball canning. Those are state-of-the-art factories they seem very good labor standards. So the United States could bring a lot and does bring a lot by being present. Mm-hmm. But the proximity to China, the involvement of Chinese companies over the years means there is a very heavy Chinese presence now. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't room for American companies to go in, but China tends to have different labor practices. They see Myanmar much the way the United States might view Mexico, a country on our border with cheaper labor costs and the ability to transport back more easily. So it is a pretty important country for Chinese businesses and for China geopolitically. So there is room to navigate, but right now the American presence is dwarfed by a Chinese presence and even a Korean and Japanese business presence.
You were there for post-coup era 2023, and you stayed until post-election era in 2026. So there's a lot of changes going on at the time. And what is the one thing that you're most proud of during your time, almost 3 years in Myanmar?
Oh, that is hard to say, because, as you say, there were a lot of changes. I think my outreach to particularly the American Chamber of Commerce and even the U.S. ASEAN Business Council back here, just to emphasize that the United States does support business in Myanmar. I think in the immediate aftermath of the coup, I don't know that that was always clear. And I think we had a rush to impose sanctions in a more scattershot way in those immediate aftermath years, so 2021 and 2022. And so it wasn't quite as clear. And so I found I had to be very direct every time I interacted with businesses to make sure that people knew that the United States wanted them to be there. So that's one thing I kind of pushed home, so that we were ready to navigate as the kind of mindset among people, both the international business community, but particularly the Myanmar people, changed. That people thought, okay, there's no quick solution. We're not happy with what happened with the 2021 coup because it reversed a landslide victory for the National League for Democracy. But we also are resigned to the fact that it's not going to change militarily. So when this election was announced, even though just manifestly it was not a free and fair election, but this mindset shift was, okay, it's better than the status quo, so we can go forward. And by having American companies stay there, we were ready to take advantage of that, meaning that as the economy grows, they're still there and they can grow.
Since we're Asia Forward, let's do Asia Forward thinking and let's look ahead. So where do you see Myanmar's future in the next 5 years in terms of its role in terms of Southeast Asia's economy?
It's interesting, over the past couple of years, ASEAN has towed the line of Myanmar is still very much a member, but not having political leadership at meetings. And what will be interesting is after the formation of a new government, whether ASEAN will continue to adhere to the non-political representation. We saw this in the foreign ministers' retreat in January, where Myanmar was represented by the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not the foreign ministry. Or the foreign minister. So looking ahead, I think ASEAN has resented the fact they had to spend so much time and energy worrying about Myanmar. I think ASEAN in general would very much like to have Myanmar come back into the fold so they can concentrate on more core issues such as the free trade area, fisheries, the South China Sea issues, clean cities and energy, All of those things, and with the addition of Timor-Leste, Myanmar has the potential not to be the most backward country. I mean, of course, it's got riches, resources, human capital. It has every reason to be a leader the way it was back before the socialist era back in the 50s. It was the richest country in Southeast Asia. It was a transportation hub, et cetera. And I think that is the hope is that it can be integrated and can be a very consequential member of ASEAN again.
So if Myanmar were to continue this political instability, what does it look like in Myanmar's future in 5 years forward in terms of, because in Southeast Asia, the supply chain and economies are all connected. But if this instability continues, what does it look like for Myanmar's future?
It is obviously a negative for Myanmar's future. I think as a low labor but highly skilled labor, and what I mean by that is not in a technical sense, but that Myanmar workers are very conscientious. They can follow directions very well, and so they are very good and productive workers. And so that made Myanmar a bright spot for labor. So if there is consistent instability, if conscription continues, and some of the platforms of political parties were to continue conscription, and again, if the conflict continues, that's something to watch, then that could make Myanmar very unattractive for manufacturing, as a source of inexpensive labor.
Would ASEAN leave Myanmar behind and go ahead with it in terms of development?
I think that would be the case. I mean, we're seeing that a little bit already because when the United States imposed the 40% tariffs on Myanmar goods, it's not because there are so many tariffs on U.S. goods into Myanmar, although there are these import license restrictions, but it's because the trade imbalance is so severe because of the import license restrictions. So therefore, it was about 90% of the bilateral trade was Myanmar goods going to the United States and only 10% of U.S. goods going to Myanmar. So that imposition of 40% tariffs made suddenly manufactured goods in Myanmar unattractive. And that saw movement to Vietnam or to Cambodia rather than Myanmar. And I think if the conflict continues, you can expect that to continue too, because, of course, the military would have no incentive to loosen the import restrictions. Therefore, the trade imbalance wouldn't be resolved, and you'd still have the tariffs. And you'd have ASEAN looking to manage political risk, et cetera. So I think Myanmar stands to lose out, which should be an area where they could compete very attractively.
Yeah, in terms of ASEAN, a lot of countries are trying to diversify beyond China in terms of manufacturing. And Myanmar, do you think it's a possibility that they could move their productions into Myanmar for U.S. businesses thinking about going in? Which sectors, which industries would be having the early onset advantage of going in early as soon as it seems possible for Myanmar to be open?
Yeah, it's starting with low skilled. So when I said highly skilled, I meant the highly productive is a better way to phrase that. But I think if education gets back on track, certainly the desire, and you see this in other ASEAN countries, is to get into a more medium or higher skilled labor force. But all of this is a little bit of crystal ball gazing right now. I think that because of the universities, if you look at Creative Cities initiatives, you need to have an educated workforce to go in for technical, particularly technology or technical skills. The internet, for all the difficulties facing Myanmar right now, the bandwidth is not terrible, certainly compared to 2014-15 before the liberalization of the telecom sector. But there are internet controls that make it very difficult to do business. And so those would have to be removed. But if that happened, given Myanmar's location, it's in a sweet spot in between India, China, Bangladesh, Thailand, obviously, it's got a border with Laos as well. And so you can imagine as a place to manufacture and ship out, you could reach the world. I mean, it really is a crossroads. And so U.S. companies getting in, you also have a wealthy class in Myanmar. I was amazed talking to the Ford dealerships saying that they could sell cars that retail for like $100,000, and there are markets they could sell more than they can make.
Wow.
Yeah. So not only is it, low skilled, but you could get higher skilled and you could get higher end products and would have a market locally and a market for export.
And with the digital economy and retail shifting from in-person to online and financial technology, do you see Myanmar adapting to that change, or is Myanmar stuck in time?
Myanmar is trying to adapt to digital currencies and digital transactions. And so they enacted something called Myanmar Pay last year that was supposed to harmonize a bunch of bespoke digital payment plans from banks. And it's actually pretty clever. The banks you don't even need an account at the bank. You can give cash on this account, in your digital wallet from the bank. So it's not a bank account. And then while it's just sitting there in your account, the bank can use it. So that's what the advantage is for the bank.
Banks.
Right.
Yeah.
But otherwise, there's no transaction fees, and you can use it at any place that accepts that bank. So KBZ Pay, Aya Pay, et cetera. Myanmar Pay was supposed to harmonize all of this together, and they haven't quite done it.
Is it by the central bank or?
Yes, it's going through the Central Bank of Myanmar. And the Central Bank of Myanmar is not sanctioned by the U.S. government. There have been cries that we should do that, but it is not sanctioned by the U.S. government. And it is a way to move currency. What I always found interesting is at what exchange rate are you charged? So it's best for Myanmar Chat transactions. And it is a good way within the country to move around. And people, all this labor force that's overseas, have to repatriate currency. Again, for your podcast listeners, I'm not going to get into the complications of the different exchange rates that you can repatriate at, but all of that has to go into a bank digitally too. So I think Myanmar is poised to take advantage of the digital revolution in banking, but it still has some work to do, and connectivity is a big issue. But one thing I will say, Kachin State had at one point a total telecom blackout, as did Rakhine. But then people adapted and they started using satellite links. And so therefore, they're more connected now than other places. In some ways, they've got better internet than I had at my home in Yangon. So it remains to be seen how people adapt. But the telecoms has the potential to reach all parts of the country, and so to enfranchise everyone.
Yeah, there is somewhat of a mistrust, generational mistrust with the bank system.
Yes.
As we have seen in the most recent coup, the difficulty to withdraw money from your own account in ATM has probably give PTSD to previous times. And also, I think United States have sanctioned some other financial transactions or the going in and out between banks from international transfers, right? So would that make it difficult for U.S. businesses to use the systems that they're familiar with to do businesses in the country?
It's not because of U.S. sanctions. It's because of the Financial Action Task Force blacklisting of Myanmar, and because of Tom Andrews of the United Nations Rapporteur on Myanmar. He came out with a very critical report in 2024 saying that banks in Singapore were being used to finance weapons procurement for the military regime in Myanmar. And so that made Singapore banks say, you know what, the transaction volume is not that big, we are stopping. And so we've found even like Bank of America, there are certain U.S. banks that are very reluctant to do transactions with legitimate businesses in Myanmar because the volume is so small that it's not worth the risk. But the United States government has not sanctioned all banks, and particularly not private banks in Myanmar, just MICB and MFTB. Those were the two banks that the military was using for international currency transactions. Now they're all at the Myanmar Economic Bank. And again, there have been lots of calls for the U.S. government to sanction MEB, but the U.S. government has not done so far.
Would that deter U.S. companies to have interest in going into Myanmar? And what other things that they might need to consider? Yes, reputational risk, working with sanctions, and lack of connectivity sometimes. And what other things do they need to consider?
Well, you do raise a good point in that when you have money invested in Myanmar, it is difficult to get it out because of the difficulty in financing international transactions. And that is something that it would behoove the military regime to to liberalize the economy to make international transactions more palatable, because it would be a normative economy and not such a war economy the way it is now. So that is something that American companies should look at. In my experience, most American investment was not for manufacturing for export, but manufacturing for the domestic market. Again, it's a big enough market. Even if it's only 50 million people now, that's still 50 million people. So you can make money just within the country. But that investment would be hard to take out because of the convertibility issues and the difficulty financing international transactions at the moment.
Well, Ambassador Susan Stevenson, thank you so much for giving time for our podcast. And it was amazing conversation. And I thank you for your time in Myanmar, in my home country.
It was my pleasure. And I'm very happy to be on this podcast.
And thank you all for tuning in. And I hope you have a good insight into how Myanmar economy is working, and for U.S. businesses, if you're thinking about going in, what you should consider. And for our Asia Forward podcast, full episodes are available on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow us on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our website as well. And I look forward to seeing you all in our future episodes.